Welcome to One Work, 5 Questions with Donna Vitek and Dr. Mark Andrew Holowchak. I have to read my name. Like, I don't know who's doing the show. Anyway, how are you tonight?
I'm okay. I'm just sort of a little nonplussed by that introduction, not knowing who you are. I hope so.
Yeah, with Donna Vitek.
Self-knowledge is what they say at the Oracle at Delphi, Gnothi Sapphon, know yourself. So you ought to know yourself. And
Who?
okay.
No. Yeah.
I'm okay. Okay, I'm ready to rock on this.
You're ready to rock? I'm really excited. Well, I'm always excited about every episode. So how do we tell the difference? But I'm really excited about this episode, Thomas Jefferson's query, 18 Notes on the State of Virginia. I have some, I just think it's so interesting, that the topic and what you may think it's about. But first, we have to do your credentials. Real quickly, okay? So Dr. Holowchak is a retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Camden, University of Ohio, Ohio University, Rutgers University. I'm just getting university'd out here. He's the editor of Journal of Thomas Jefferson in his time, and he has authored numerous books on Thomas Jefferson and close to 175 essays. And I highly encourage you to read Dr. Holowchak's books, anything you can get. It will help improve your writing skills, along with teach you something about history.
24 livres.
And you will improve your vocabulary. I have pages and I have a whole file of notes of vocabulary words that I don't use.
Well, if listeners want to know something about my neurosis, I guess I have taped vocabulary lists on my driver's steering wheel and on my bike when I do my bike ride, so that I can memorize words I don't know, or phrases, or even sayings in other languages, in Latin or Greek or whatever and stuff.
Oh, wow.
I love words. I really do love words. We'll do a One Word 5 Questions on Thomas Jefferson and language one of these days coming up.
Oh, that sounds interesting. I like that.
It'll be very technical, though, I promise you.
Yeah, I had to look up a few.
It'll be for the philologists in the audience.
Philologists?
Philologists.
Oh, okay. Okay. So today's episode, the Query 18 Notes on the State of Virginia, I found it very interesting because what I like to do when we're doing an episode is I look up the topic, the letter, and I try to read what other people, how they've assessed the writing, and to get an idea on what to expect and what it's about. And
a lot of cherry picking on this one.
Oh, I'm very cautious. I feel confident.
I'm saying a lot of people who draw from this cherry pick.
Yeah.
I'll give you an instance when we get going.
Okay. But
if the listeners don't know, or viewers don't know what cherry picking is, it's just picking they pick what they want, and they ignore what they don't like. They want to something agree with the thesis, when you can't do that if you're doing above board history. You have to read the thing as a whole, and then
right. Well, as soon as I start, when I read someone's assessment of his writing, if I find that their intent is to just slander, then I stop. I move on to the next thing. So I try.
You like my Guinness on the pencil here?
I can detect intent pretty quickly. So what I thought was neat is this query was written on manners. It was entitled Manners, and it does talk about slavery, but manners are how you treat others. So
the notion is this one of the questions, or are you just?
No, this isn't one of the. Well, it's not one of my 5, so this is 5.5. No.
Okay.
But not really wasn't one of the. I do have a question within the intro, and what I'd like to know about this query was this a personal writing of Jefferson's, or was this intended? Did he know it was going to be published, or was this his own personal writing?
Oh, well,
Manners?
you have to get my book on Jefferson and Notes on Virginia to answer that question. I talk all about the history of it. It wasn't intended initially to be published.
Oh,
And at some point, there were many, this is something we could talk about later, but there are many different versions of this. It was published early. He took the manuscript with him to France, to Paris, to get it cheaply published because the Philadelphia publishers were very pricey. So he knew he can get it published more cheaply. So he did, I think, get something like 200 copies of it printed just to hand out to his friends and chums, people that would be, it wasn't the sort of thing that, the average Joe on the street was going to want to read. It's very
right.
technical. If you look at some of the stuff, he gives lists of birds, lists of animals, and who's going to want to wade through that? People don't want to read that. So it's a very technical book that, and people had to be of a certain scientific disposition to appreciate the book.
Okay,
So it was not
yeah.
intended, he was going to publish it, send it out. He wanted to send some copies out to students at William and Mary, intended for a specific audience, people of Jefferson Republican bent. The book got, just to make a long story short, the book got sort of, one of the copies was sent to a guy named Williamos, who actually, strange story here, he wound up being a British spy who would hang out with Jefferson. Jefferson found out at some point this guy was a spy. The guy died, and the copy that Williamos had went to somebody else and went to a French publisher. They translated it into French, mutilated the whole thing through the translation. Jefferson finds out about this. It gets livid, so they agreed to have a better French translation done with the same publisher. He's still not happy with that. At some point, he has an English publisher say, let's publish this thing in English. And that's the 1878 publication that comes out. And Jefferson was not happy with that either. He was happiest with the first version that came out as soon as he got it published, first English. We had English, French, and then English.
So I guess the point, and I find this very.
So let me say this real quickly but it wasn't intended to be published and put out to the general public. Once the French version comes out, he decides to make it generally accessible to the public in English. So it wound up being generally accessible.
Okay, so okay. So when he wrote this, so we need to keep in mind as you're listening, as our readers are listening to the questions and answers and what we're discussing, we need to keep in mind that these were his own personal thoughts that he never intended. This wasn't like writing policy or writing something knowing the masses were going to read it, and
well, the masses weren't going to read it anyway. It's just too technical. But it was also a political document because it was an expression of his republicanism. So
yeah. So okay. So we know now, and we'll know as we're going through this how Thomas Jefferson. I'll be honest with you. In reading this, it was a little emotional for me. This is the first time I've ever read anything of Jefferson's that almost made me cry. It literally. I mean, I had tears in my eyes because of I could feel his passion and his fear for our society in what he was writing. And he even made reference to something I never thought I'd hear out of his mouth, considering his religious views. So that's what made me take it so seriously. So let's get to our questions. But and I'll try not to cry.
I know what you're referring to anyway. With respect,
it was very emotional reading this. He's really, and I will defend him. He really did not. He really wanted mankind to check their morals and values regarding slavery. Okay, question number 1. The most striking oddity in this topic is supposed to the customs of manners of Virginians. The query is wholly devoted to slavery. Why is that?
I don't know. That to me is an oddment. It's an oddity. The Francois Barbé Marbois sends him 22 queries. He comes back with 23 queries. He organizes things on, as Jefferson didn't like the order of the questions. So he, that's another story. But Jefferson changes the questions. And what Marbois is asking, he says, the particular customs and manners that may happen to be received in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And Jefferson only talks about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that? Well, one, and this you'll like, I'm sure. I think it's a measure of his abhorrence of slavery. That when someone asks him about the custom and manners, well, instead of saying X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, whatever, these are all, and then I'll talk a little about slavery. Forget all that. Let's just talk about slavery. There's one thing we practice in our state that I find particularly abhorrent and would like to see liquidated, and that's slavery. So that itself, for the people who think Jefferson didn't care about the eradication of slavery, didn't do anything. In his only published book, he gives a rather grandiloquent and eloquent expression of the evils of slavery.
Well, and also too, the dictionary that defines manners as a person's outward bearing or way of behaving towards others. So if somebody was asking about manners and that is what stood out to him as the way that the slave masters were treating the slaves, and what the children, and how the children watching was just going to perpetuate it generation after generation if we didn't change.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that the fact that he brought up, children are watching, they're watching the adults and how the adults are treating the slaves. And okay, I'm not going to get emotional. Okay, question number 2. So we're going to talk wholly about slavery with this. That's what the section was about. There are 3 main arguments in this query. What is the first?
Well, you're talking, you pretty much gave it. He talks about the unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. Now, he talks about the commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Okay, so he's talking about the slave. He's not talking about every instance, but on the whole, it's a relationship of owner and one who is owned. It's despotism and submission, right? And he's talking and he's alluding to here slave owners that'll beat their slaves and things like that and treat them as if they're chattel. So he talks about unremitting destiny. He says the children see this, you're talking about this, and they learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. Plato. The quality is the germ of all education in him. From his cradle to his grave, he's learning to do what he sees other to do. So the idea is, he says the parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in a small circle of slaves, gives a loose to his worst passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. And he ends, he says, the man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved in such circumstances. So if you're engaged in a practice that treats another part of the population as inferior, and you continually act as the role of the superior, there's a certain degradation that you're going to see among the owners of slaves, and it's going to be passed on from generation. We talked of in prior episodes that Jefferson's real cynosure, his model Jeffersonian Republican citizen, is whom? Remember? He puts up, which hero does he have as a moral celebrity? Jesus. This is not sort of what Jesus was preaching in the 4 Gospels, was it?
No.
So, he says it's just the slave owners will become despots, the children will be despots, and you're going to wind up behaving in any way other than a moral way. By the way, this is our 40th episode.
Oh, I know. I was just looking. I said, I forgot to mention it's our 40th episode. Wow.
We've been doing this for over a year. I know we missed some episodes.
Yeah, yeah.
Jeff sounds excited. You
So
excited by that, Jeff?
yes, Jeffy, 40 episodes of Jeffy.
Okay, so I
Okay,
mean,
what was the
but
second argument of the query?
okay, let's see. And this is, we talked about the despotism and the submission. So with respect to the slave owners, you're going to see despotism, tyranny.
Mhm.
With respect to the slaves, you're going to see submission, slavery, thraldom. And he says, for if a slave can have, and the second argument concerns amor patriae, love of country. The argument is that a slave cannot have love of country. Right?
Right.
He's not going to care, because if I grow up in a country in which I'm a slave, I'm going to hate the country. He says, if a slave can have a country in this world, it must be any other in preference to that in which he is born, to live and labor for another, in which he must lock up the faculties of his nature, contribute as far as depends on his individual endeavors to the evanishment of the human race, um, or entail his own miserable condition on the endless generations proceeding from him. So we have the slaves too are not going to be, if they wind up being integrated into the community, whether through miscegenation or whatever, just accepted, they're going to hate the country, even if freed or something. They're what a claim, right? We don't see racial tensions right now, do we?
Mhm.
Right? So
Yeah, and
they're going to
teaching.
hate they're going to hate the country in which they live. That's the second argument, that it teaches submission in the enslaved people, and that those people who are taught to be submissive and cowardly will not have love of country. So they're not going to be really loving citizens.
Mhm. Okay, so I can see his. To me, when I was reading it, I could hear his fear of what if this didn't stop, what it was going to do to the country, and it did happen in 1861, didn't it?
Yeah, it happened,
It
and
did.
he sort of anticipated that.
Hmm.
Right now, one can, we're working on assumption too, an assumption I don't buy, that the cause of the Civil War was slavery. Wasn't, in my estimation. I think economic considerations were the major role. Not that slavery didn't have any part in the ideological explanation and the cause of the war, but the narrative, when you look at, the whole Abraham Lincoln story, and he's fighting the free. No, he didn't fight the war from that, from anything I
So,
can.
well, the only thing we do have access to primary source documents, which the court
Sure.
filings of each state did file a court document, and in that document, they did list why they were seceding from the union. So we do have those primary source documents that we can look at for that. But
And
we will get to
documents are formal expressions as well, sometimes
yeah.
not always being sincere, but yeah.
So okay, what is the third? What is the third argument in the letter?
Well, this goes back. He says right after that, he says, with the morals of the people, their industry is destroyed. For in a warm climate, no man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him. This is so true. I hate people when they quantify truth. True can't be greater or less,
Right.
So instead of saying this is so true, Jefferson, just say this is true. Okay, it's so true that the proprietors of slaves, a very small proportion indeed, are ever seen to labor. Right? The idea here being that the slave owners get lazy. If I
Mhm.
can make someone else work, I'm not going to work. So I'm not industrious.
Right.
Jefferson's model for an ideal Republican government is that most of the people are going to be farmers, and some few people
Mhm.
will manufacture needed goods, especially for farming. And everybody should be optimally industrious, right? Should be deedy, should be working, should be productive. And if you're going to have, masters and slaves, and the masters can force the slaves to do all the work, you're not utilizing. We talk of today about women's rights and women not being in the workforce. Not, we don't talk about that as much as we talk about race, and but a lot of people, now that women are working, Plato knew this, that women could do the same things that men could do. He says that women could be soldiers, women could be rulers, and so
Mhm.
forth. So a lot of people will recognize with respect to the plight of women that we've wasted half of our resources for centuries by not allowing women to do some of the things they were capable of doing. And Jefferson's concern here is industry, the argument from industry about the slave owners are becoming slothful, lazy.
Okay. Okay, so we're to question number 5, but I have so many more questions.
Well, we can, we have a lot of time, I think, right?
You have told me in private conversation that there's something odd about this query. Would you like to share that with the?
Yes, this is something no one has discovered other than me. And I don't say that boastfully or pompous. I say it boastfully, but not pompously, not arrogantly. What's missing here? Everybody talks, a lot of people, Paul Finkelman, we'll just call him Fink. He hates Thomas Jefferson. He says Jefferson is the creepiest person I've ever encountered. That makes me think Finkelman is a big creep. He hates Thomas Jefferson. He looks at this passage and says the only reason Jefferson wants to eradicate slavery in there is because it has bad effects on whites. He talks about the ill effects on the slaves. But let's forget what's one thing is missing in this. Where do you find the word white? Do you see it anywhere?
No, and actually, what I can do, I have my my note open.
But I'm asking you, when you look at the passage,
no.
Does the word white appear?
No.
Does the word black appear?
No.
Does the word Caucasian or Negro appear?
No.
He talks about slave owners and slaves.
Right.
Gender is, race is not the issue here.
Right.
If race were the issue, he would talk about it. He would talk about black and white. He doesn't. He's talking about the institution of slavery where one man is treating another as someone would treat a cow or whatever, as chattel. So very interesting. He's not really concerned so much about the black-white issue here. He's concerned about any person who's in the position of slave is going to be in contempt of his country, and any person, there were numerous, not of course as many as white, but there were numerous black slave owners who owned black slaves and some white slaves. This applies to them too.
Right.
I did research in my book.
It's the slaveholder and the slave, those positions, not the color of those positions, because he knew that there were black slave owners and
yes, a black slave owner is going to be just as bad as a white slave owner in his treatment of slaves, because the institution forces you to exercise your power and to be destroyed by that power if you're a slave. That no one's ever noticed. Now, maybe I make too much of this. I don't think I do.
No, I'm glad that you I'm actually glad that you pointed that out. That
but the thing is, race is not mentioned here. And Jefferson will talk about black slaves many places, right? And the issue is black and white. It's not here. He's talking about an institution that is,
and he could have written that if he wanted, because this was supposed to be for his own personal use. So, but he didn't.
Well, at some point he was, even if it was going to be sent out to students and stuff, so it was going to circulate. So, and he knew it was going to circulate, but it wasn't going to be among the general public. It wasn't going to be made public for anybody who wanted to buy it. But the general public weren't going to be interested in this book anyway, because filled with stats and all sorts of detailed information that you're going to read. And unless you're like I am, you're interested in details, you're going to say, gives a damn about that.
Right.
So that's one thing. Well, then there's another thing to which you referred earlier. He talks about, and I think you were talking about liberties as the gift of God and God's wrath. I think you got all excited when he's thinking that God
that it may become probable by supernatural interference, that he was hoping that he's even that's to me that's the desperation, that him writing this was the desperation he felt that even though he didn't believe in the supernatural, that wasn't his direction with religion, but he was even willing to hope for that, just so
No, I don't think he was hoping for it. He was fearing that.
he wanted
He
it
was,
to be over.
he was, no, I don't think that follows. I think, if God, he's just saying, if God is just, he's not going to allow injustice prevail.
Right.
When he's talking about, he does talk about God interfering. He's talking about it may become probable by supernatural interference. I have argued, I think, beautifully and cogently that Jefferson does not believe in a God that interferes in human affairs. Why? Following Lord Bolingbroke, God, when he creates the world, gets it right the first time. He doesn't need to have a set of sun to correct things because humans screw things up. He creates humans, and everything he creates is the way he wanted it, because God is powerful enough. He's not going to screw things up, and he's not going to need some mechanic like a sun to come in and to fix things. So when he's talking about supernatural interference, he's basically saying this is one case where you don't take him literally. And we can talk about, if listeners want to see why I believe Jefferson didn't think God was intervened in human affairs. I'll explain that. There's some very weighty evidence that shows that he didn't. So I take that to mean God might, supernatural interference, meaning maybe God has things set up in the scheme of things. So as events unfold, the Black people or the slaves will have an uprising, right? Because you look at early Lynchburg, when I wrote my book on Lynchburg, there was a natural alliance between Black slaves and really penurious, meaning very super poor white people. There's a natural political alliance. And in Lynchburg, they solved that problem by creating a racial barrier, by making the white people feel somehow degraded by aligning themselves with the Blacks, the freed Blacks after the Civil War, or the slaves. So the Republicans of the day then would have wanted all white people to think alike. They wanted the very poor white people to line up with the wealthier white people so that they wouldn't line up and create a large population, especially after emancipation, that could form a bloc and work against the interests of the wealthy white people. So the idea of, at least in Lynchburg and some southern cities, is to create a separation between whites and Blacks for the advantage of the wealthy, which tended to be overwhelmingly white people. So when he's talking about, anyways, go back to this, when he talks about supernatural interference, I think he's talking about the possibility of God having set things up that where there is injustice, the injustice will unravel, injustice will prevail through either a revolution, a slave revolution. And there were a lot of Black uprisings in Jefferson's day, and there was great fear. One thing I can say is very interesting, is that in the previous query 17.
Okay.
No, it's not. I'm trying to see. Anyways, but one of the things I want to say is that, there were uprisings of Black slaves, and there was always that. And the number of slaves is something like a 12 to 11 ratio between whites and Blacks. And one had to take very seriously a slave uprising. If the numbers are roughly equal, and Black slaves, for example, banded together and rose up against their owners, this could create a serious problem. That's one of the reasons why we talked about Jefferson didn't free his slaves. I mentioned this in one of my talks on YouTube. The Virginia law was, if you freed a slave, that slave had to leave the state within a year, or you become a slave again.
Oh, so I have.
Why is that?
Because they could fear for their safety.
Yeah, the revolution. They wanted out of the state, so that wouldn't happen.
Well, can I have a bonus question?
If you can. If you want. I mean,
we have time?
Yeah,
we have time. Okay. Well, at the end of the query, he says, in the order of events to be with the consent of the masters, he's hoping that slavery is that there's total emancipation, by the consent of the masters rather than by their extirpation. Is he talking about the slave, the emancipation because the slaves revolted against the masters?
No, he's he's waxing optimistically, as Jefferson is. He oftentimes is overly optimistic, and it's sort of, you wonder what he's looking at, because when you look at his writings on slavery, he notes that he gives up on actions on slavery later in life because the time's not right. I tried to act on it before, and people are not ready for it. He actually thinks that people are getting worse. The slave owners want to hold on to their slaves. So he says we must be content to hope they will force their way into everyone's mind, right? In other words, this notion of freeing slaves, because I think a change is already perceptible since the origin of the present revolution. He's talking about the American Revolution, I assume, right? The spirit of the master is abating, is lessening. That of the slave rising from the dust, his condition mollifying, getting better. The way Jefferson used some good words here too. I like that. The way I hope preparing under the auspices of heaven for a total emancipation, and this is what you're referred to, that this is disposed in the order of events to be with the consent of masters rather than by their extirpation, by their elimination. In other words, the masters are consenting to let go of their slaves.
Okay.
Now one problem is people say, well, just free your slaves. Now, in the South, you couldn't do that without crippling yourself, because most of your money is tied up in your slaves. You can say, okay, owning other people is wrong. Fine. It is wrong. But if I'm born into this and I own, for example, 500 slaves, and each slave is, on average, say, I'm throwing out a term, $500, it's a considerable amount of money that I have tied up, right? Which is a large argument against beating slaves in the first place. Right. If you're my property, and if I beat you, unless you're really, really hard to handle, I'm going to get rid of you. I'm not going to beat you. This couldn't have happened as often as people say it happened, because if I beat you, I can't get any work out of you. Right. And if I beat you, I can't sell you. And I'm not talking about black or white here. I'm just talking about master slave.
Right.
So I'm not of the opinion or of the disposition that, slaves black slaves who were sent over on boats were treated. There are two ways they were treated. One is they'd fill the boat up with as many slaves as they could, figuring that 25% is going to die. But again, the weaker ones are going to die, and that's fine. Throw them overboard and we'll make money. The other is to take only healthy, robust ones and give them enough space so that I can sell them for a high price. And both of those things were practiced at times. And, so he's hoping here, he says, I can see a change. What is he looking at? Where's the change taking place? It's not happening. He even says, a couple decades after writing this, he says the people are not disposed to eliminate slavery. So it doesn't happen in his lifetime. And he throws up his arms saying that it's the role of the next generation to do something about it. They're not doing it.
Right. Okay. When I read that, I read that last line a few times, and then I had to look up what extirpation meant. And when I read the definition, I thought, is he worried about the slaves killing them? Like they're free either by the master's consent or because they eliminated the masters.
It's going to be sloppy. With the consent of the masters rather by their extirpation.
Right. So he's hoping that the slaves
there is, like you're reading it, probably refers to the masters, unless he's writing sloppily.
Oh, okay. I thought it meant, which means rather than due to the master's extirpation. The masters
by the slaves through a revolt.
Yeah.
So he's looking at the two possibilities. He doesn't consider the option of miscegenation, and he wasn't too open to that anyway. He does say in a couple places, he says elsewhere in Query 14, that when white blood and black blood is mixed, there is a degeneration in the offspring. And he says this is observed in every instance. He says, now, where does he see this? was clearly, bad reasoning there in query 14. So, Jefferson, we can accuse him of saying, you claim to be an empiricist, and every instance of mingling of white and black blood creates a degeneration seen from the perspective of the white. What observations do you have? Clearly, that's bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
But he was, he could be convicted of spouting bullshit from time to time, where stuff that he didn't really see.
Yeah.
Maybe he got it in a book. It could
Yeah.
be one of the books that he was reading. Black people generally were seen by all scientists at the time as a degenerative race, whether the degeneration had occurred through, whether it was biological, which created the problem, because the Bible said God created all human beings, right? So there had to be a reason for, a lot of people said later after Jefferson died, maybe there were more than one creation where God created different races at different times. That explains different, the superiority and inferiority, so, you need an explanation for that. Jefferson is open to that. He's also open to the possibility of the degeneration occurring just naturally by separation in different cultural contamination over time, or lack of, different cultures over time.
Can you tell us real quick about the book I have, Rethinking Thomas Jefferson's Writings on Slavery and Race? Can you tell us that's your book?
This is published by Cambridge Scholars, I think in 2020 or 19, I don't know. And it's, I talk about everything we've been talking about here. I talk about Jefferson's views. I talk about the science of race. And the science of race was just being studied for the first time. And the scientists were mostly Europeans. And their conclusions were, by what we know today, roughly speaking, wrong. But Jefferson read that science, he assimilated it. So I talk about the science. I talk about, comb thoroughly Jefferson's writings on race and slavery, and come up with a view that, that places Jefferson's views on race and slavery within the context of his own time.
Okay.
Instead of judging him from today. Yeah, that God's justice cannot sleep forever is probably from query 18, is it not?
Did I spell governor right? Okay. So quickly, but before we get cut off, our next episode will be Thomas Jefferson, Governor William, letter to William H. Harrison, 27th of February, 1803.
Yeah, that talks about his anti-city sentiments, and there's a lot about Native Americans here. Jefferson says he's going to be a president sometime, and Jefferson says, do not share the contents of this letter with anyone, he says after that. So what is it that